Hello, my name is Walt Supke, and I'm here to talk about building ventilation, what everyone should know. What is this presentation about? Is this presentation about my house and what I should be doing in terms of ventilation in my house? Is this presentation about a clubhouse and what we should be doing in a clubhouse? No. This presentation is about building ventilation everywhere, all buildings. This is an image of Lima, Peru, and it turns out that Lima, Peru has the highest death rates per 100,000 people in the world. It's pretty significant. This is a picture again of Lima, Peru, and the image is quite clear. So let me introduce myself. I collaborated and shared COVID-19 systems research with others at Drexel University and the MITRE Healthcare Coalition starting in 2020. The research was about determining the probability of infection using common operational living scenarios. And this actually changed the dialogue to admit that the COVID-19 virus is airborne and that ventilation is critical. Up to that point, what we had engineers and scientists basically signing petitions, but no one was providing numbers. And I sat down and I pulled out all kinds of different equations and started to apply numbers to different living scenarios. And once the media was contacted, it's amazing. Within 24 hours, the story broke that the virus is airborne and that ventilation is an issue. I captured this information in a book, and that book is called COVID-19: A Systems Perspective. If this presentation is being offered to an audience, so to speak, a large audience, now is a good time to pause the presentation and let folks talk about their backgrounds. I wanted to start this presentation with what our parents and grandparents had to deal with in the last century. The image on the right, what we see open windows in a public school cafeteria circa 1908. Now at the time they were dealing with tuberculosis. The first U.S. fresh air schools for tubercular children opened in Providence, Rhode Island in 1908, and by 1910 there were 65 fresh air schools in the U.S. This was actually an international effort, and there were fresh air schools around the world to deal with tuberculosis. On the image in the left-hand side, what we see Swarthmore Public School classroom circa 1937-1943. So several decades had gone by, and what we see is the introduction of a new technology. And that new technology is ceiling level UV lights. Again, it's sometimes called upper room UV lights. This was a study performed by University of Pennsylvania that started in 1937 and lasted until 1943. And it captured an enormous amount of data to determine the effectiveness of using UV lights to deal with airborne contagions. And they basically found out that this was a very effective approach to deal with airborne contagions, and those systems wound up rolling out through the decades, and we found them in many facilities during the 50s, 60s, and even the 70s. We all grew up in a time where there was a great amount of health, and that health is attributed to the modern technologies such as forced air heating and also cooling systems and the previous century UV systems. So why is ventilation suddenly a problem? Well, it turns out that COVID-19 has become endemic, and it is like tuberculosis and measles and other airborne contagions from the previous century. It has been a leading cause of death for 2 years. Now, to eventually eliminate tuberculosis and other airborne contagions, it took vaccines and modern forced air heat and cooling systems. That's the reality. Our building ventilation systems have been ignored during the time of great health when our parents and grandparents understood building ventilation. We lost that understanding. This is an excerpt from Professor Edward Nardell from Harvard Medical School. It appeared in Time magazine. He basically wrote an article there, and I just pulled out a few key words there. COVID variants may be with us for years to come, and this will certainly not be the last respiratory virus pandemic. We have long suffered from annual contagious respiratory infections, but especially low rates of influenza and common colds during COVID-19 precautions have demonstrated that not all of this suffering need happen. We need to think clearly and scientifically about how better we can reduce the spread of viruses indoors, especially when and where masks will no longer be in common use. Are there effective engineering controls that can help indoor environments be truly safer? In May of 2021, 39 scientists published an important paper and they sent it to policymakers. It's one of these really significant documents that are produced, and it was called A Paradigm Shift to Combat Indoor Respiratory Infection. It's about a 5 to 6 page document, and again, it's targeted to policymakers around the world, and this is an excerpt from it. There is great disparity in the way we think about and address different sources of environmental infection. Governments have for decades promulgated a large amount of legislation and invested heavily in food safety, sanitation, and drinking water for public health purposes. By contrast, airborne pathogens and respiratory infections, whether seasonal influenza or COVID-19, are addressed weakly, if at all, in terms of regulations, standards, and building design and operation pertaining to the air we breathe. Ventilation. So we're going to be talking about ventilation in this presentation. Ventilation, what is it? We hear that we need ventilation in small indoor spaces, but why? And we also hear that we need to increase ventilation, but what does that mean? Ventilation, what is it? It is about ventilation performance levels. When we talk about ventilation, we need to understand what the performance levels are. For example, when you want to go off and you buy a car, depending on the kind of car you're interested in, you want to know how quickly it goes from 0 to 60. Some cars will go from 0 to 60 in 4 seconds, some in 6 seconds, and some in 14 seconds. Well, it's the same thing with ventilation performance. You want to know how good it is, but you want it reduced to some kind of number that actually matters and makes sense. Now, ventilation performance is measured as air changes per hour. ACH is a measure of how often the air changes in the room. So, for example, 1 ACH changes the room air 1 time per hour. 20 ACH changes the room air 20 times per hour, or every 3 minutes. So there's a relationship you should have in your head. Basically, if you're changing the air every 3 minutes, you divide that into 60, and that translates into 20 air changes per hour. 20 air changes per hour divided into 60 gives you 3 minutes. Now, disease specialists address ventilation only in terms of air changes per hour. And there's a simple formula that you use to calculate air changes per hour. Basically, you determine the size of your fan in cubic feet per hour, and then you divide your room cubic feet into that fan cubic feet per hour, and that will give you the air changes per hour. Continuing along, ventilation, what is it? It is not about measuring and maintaining CO2 levels. That's the way a lot of people are talking today, and that's the way actually the industry has progressed as the decades have unfolded ever since the energy crisis back in the 70s. Anyway, continuing on, maintaining CO2 levels leads to a system where the air changes level are too low, such as 1 air change per hour or less. It is not about liters per minute or cubic feet per minute per person. That's irrelevant. This will never provide visibility into the actual air changes level in a room, and when scenarios are run, the ACH level are so low that they can approach 1 ACH or less per hour. And again, it has no meaning to talk in terms of CO2 levels, has no meaning to talk in terms of liters per minute or cubic feet per minute. So ventilation performance when dealing with airborne contagions is always in terms of air changes per hour, or ACH, in a real room setting, not in the lab and not in a test fixture. So again, for example, 60 minutes divided by changing the air every 3 minutes translates into 20 air changes per hour. So I was performing research, and one of the things that I did, which was a little bit different from the other folks, is I was approaching the problem from a systems perspective. And in systems engineering and in systems analysis, you tend to identify scenarios. So I identified different scenarios in which to attempt to understand the problem. And I identified the following kinds of scenarios. We have small indoor spaces, for example, like a classroom, which is 30 feet by 30 feet by 10 feet high. We have large indoor spaces, for example, like ShopRite or Target. They're 100 feet by 100 feet by 40 feet high. And then you have outside scenarios. You have mask on, mask off. You have different exposure times of 1, 4, 8 hours. And then you have different ventilation rates. And I used the Wells-Riley equation to basically develop these scenarios. I also used other equations from other engineering areas. For example, the nuclear engineers have their equations, mechanical engineers have their equations for dilution, and even electrical engineers have their equations for radiation exposure as you basically travel a certain distance from a radiation source like a transmitter antenna, a radio transmitter antenna, or a TV antenna. And it's amazing how all of these equations correlated and provided the same numbers. So what was found when these scenarios were analyzed? Well, what was found is that the small indoor spaces, the problem is massive in there. With the large indoor spaces, it's kind of problematic, and outside it's extremely rare. Now, what does this mean? All of this stuff was reduced to probability of infection, and the probabilities of infection range between 99% to 0.0003% and even less. Now, obviously, the outside scenarios are the probabilities that are all the way down there, 0.003%. And the problematic spaces, or actually the spaces with massive problems, are the small indoor spaces, and are 99% and 100% probability of infection. So what should be the ACH level? We know that if you have no air exchanges in the room, in other words, if the level is 0, this is going to lead to infection. We also know from empirical data that an ACH level of 1 will lead to infection. And a key piece of data that surfaced last year basically is a school district over in the Philadelphia suburbs where one of the classrooms, the damper in that classroom was partially shut down. Probably because someone was complaining about it being too cold or too hot, and the ACH level in that classroom was one air change per hour, and it turns out that there were 8 second grade students that were infected as a result of this. Now, again, what should be the ACH level? The CDC recommends 12 air changes per hour for a hospital room with airborne contagions. So the number must be greater than 1. And as the ACH increases, the risk of infection drops. So when we think in terms of ACH, there are different mental models that people have developed and then converted those mental models to real models and attempted to study them, etc. Now, many address ACH levels as a percentage of remaining contagions after 1 air change per hour. So, for example, 1 air change removes approximately 63% of the room air contaminants, and the second air change removes about 63% of what remains, and so on. And in this mental model, what they do is they start with a known amount of contagion, and there's nothing adding more contagion. It's just sort of measured and dropped off with time. But that's not a real scenario, because we know that when a person is infected, they're constantly releasing the virus. It's not a one-time event, and now you start to measure things. It's also difficult to understand what these numbers will lead to. We'll get there in a minute. Now, in systems engineering, what we have two specialties. There's safety engineering and reliability engineering, where they perform analysis. And in that analysis, it's actually about probabilities, relative probabilities, and time before failure. And those numbers actually can give you an indication of how you can live and what you can do. So applying systems engineering safety and reliability concepts to, again, ACH provides a quick view on the effectiveness of the ACH levels and, again, how one can behave. So this is the ACH various analysis perspective reduced to numbers, so we can start to make some comparisons. The first 3 columns are basically coming from the medical world. they talk about ACH and they talk about removal of the virus at 99% efficiency, for example, or 99.9% efficiency, or remaining virus. And those are all interesting numbers, but it really doesn't tell me how to live. Okay, and it really doesn't give me an indication of what I should be doing with my ACH levels, because again, I really don't know how this translates into how I should be living in a real world scenario. Now the columns on the right, they come from systems engineering, and again, there's the safety world and there's the reliability world. So let me just walk through the scenarios here a bit so we have some feeling for what's going on with these numbers. We know that if there is 0 ACH, the probability of infection is 100%. Okay. We also know that if the ACH is at 1, the probability of infection is 100% because of that classroom data point that I provided, 8 students being infected in a second grade class. What we don't know, however, is the size of that class. Was it a class of 8 students, where therefore it really would be 100%, or was it a class of, for example, 16 students and only half the students were infected? So maybe that probability then is 50% probability of infection. But let's start with just 100% probability of infection. If you increase the ACH level to 50%, well, you can say, okay, we started at 100% at 1. What happens if we double the ACH rate? A reasonable perspective is, well, it drops off, right? Divides by 2, so we get 50%. Divide by 4, we get 25%. Divide by 6, we get 17%. On down the line. Now all of a sudden what we have is something that we can sort of relate to, and it's probability of infection as the ACH level increases. And we see that when we start to approach 12 ACH, we have an 8% probability of infection that would have happened in that classroom, as opposed to what really happened, which was 100%. And again, if we're talking about 16 students versus 8 students out of the total class size, then instead of being 8%, that would be 4%. Now that's from the safety world, and this is what we do when we design everything that exists around us. This is what we do to ensure, for example, that when you're driving down the freeway, the tires don't fly off on your car as you're driving 65 miles an hour. All kinds of analysis is done, all kinds of probabilities are determined, and that comes from the safety world. There's the reliability world, where they try to figure out when something fails, at what point will something fail, in how many hours will it fail. So if we take a look at 0 air changes per hour, once again, in these different infection scenarios, does the infection happen in 1 hour, does it happen in a half an hour, or does it happen in 15 minutes? My analysis actually suggests that it happens in about 10 to 15 minutes. But let's just leave these numbers here for now. With 1 air change per hour, again going to that data point of the school district in the Philadelphia suburb where the second grade children were infected, 8 of them out of some class size. Maybe that happened within an hour, or maybe it happened during a morning session, a 4-hour session, or maybe it happened during the entire day. It took the entire day for that class to be infected. But let's start with 1 hour. Let's just assume those kids were infected in 1 hour. Well, what happens if we have 2 air changes per hour? Well, we can stay in that classroom for 2 hours before being infected, theoretically, or we can stay in that classroom for 4 hours if the air changes per hour are 4, okay, 6 for 6 hours, 8 for 8 hours. Once the ACH level goes up to 12, we can stay in that classroom for 12 hours before being infected. Now once we leave that classroom and we come back in, our bodies do all kinds of things. They have the innate immune system that's working, so you could potentially keep re-entering that classroom and still not be infected. So these are 2 different analysis perspectives coming with 2 different mental models. You have the medical world, and then you have the engineering world, specifically the systems engineering world. Where do ACH standards and guidelines come from? Well, there's a large technical organization out there. It's 100 years old, 100 plus years old. It's called ASHRAE, American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers. There's the Center for Disease Control and Prevention that provides guidelines, and then there's the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense basically generated a huge amount of standards and guidelines after World War II, up until about 1980 to mid-1980s, when they were directed to stop doing that kind of stuff. And what they would do is they would set up laboratories and they try to understand different things, and all kinds of, I'll just say it, wonderful standards surfaced. What happened from that point forward is you had commercial bodies basically take those standards over and run with them going forward. You have the International Organization for Standardization, and you have others. Now here's the issue. Most of the ACH levels are based on comfort, except when airborne contagion mitigation is required in hospitals. Now that whole comfort thing also got modified with the energy crisis in the late 70s. Basically, when we were trying to reduce energy consumption, folks found out that they could reduce costs when basically heating and cooling the facilities. So all of a sudden the dollars started to kick in, and what has surfaced is a lot of facilities, actually not a lot, all of the facilities have had their ventilation rates significantly reduced. And this was in a time when there was great health, and also in a time when a lot of people were retiring and passing away that established these systems to deal with the contagions that existed in the previous century. So here goes some numbers. They're actually kind of all over the place. What we have is we have a hospital trauma room from the CDC. They're coming in at a minimum of 15 air changes per hour. They have no maximum because obviously the more the better. You have the hospital room airborne precautions. That's 12 air changes per hour. You have operating room, that's 25 air changes per hour. I don't have a source identified there because there were multiple sources there. And then you have EPA, and you have organizations that are companies and nonprofit organizations. I'll just flip to the next slide. And we have, Wikipedia over there, and we have basically different areas, and we have all kinds of different numbers basically suggesting different air changes per hour. So what have facility managers done? Hawaiian Airlines ventilation performance level is 20 air changes per hour, and they posted it for all passengers to see on their entertainment screens. The Philadelphia restaurant program is 15 air changes per hour, and 106 restaurants participated. Now there is a public database with hundreds of facilities showing what they have done, and there's a link down here. When you go to that database and you just look at the facilities and what different folks have done around the country, you basically start to see a pattern. And the pattern is that there's different facility types. This is basically what the research has surfaced. And facility types fall into three categories. There's elite facilities, medium facilities, and then low-end facilities. Now elite facilities, their ACH levels are excellent. Also, they have excellent maintenance. Everything's working in the system. Nothing is broken. And also, operations are excellent. The people know exactly what to do with the ventilation system, and it's always operated properly, perfectly. In medium facilities, you have lower ACH levels, and the maintenance might be excellent, and the operations might also be excellent. And then you have the low-end facilities. With the low-end facilities, basically you have lower levels of ACH levels, like in the medium facilities, but the maintenance is poor. You'll have zones that are not working, vents that are closed off. You basically just have poor maintenance. Filters are not being replaced or clogged, etc. And the operations might actually be excellent. They might be operating it properly, but it doesn't matter because things are broken in the system. Another kind of low-end facility, again, the ACH levels are lower. They may have excellent maintenance, but the people that operate the facility don't know what to do. They don't know that the ventilation needs to be running, for example, when the public is present. And then you have low-end facilities where the ACH levels are basically at 0 or 1, essentially none. And those facilities will also have very poor maintenance and very poor operations because they just don't care. They're basically at the bottom. Now the issue is, where does your facility fall? Now there's different ventilation approaches, and again, this is from the research findings. There's natural ventilation. As the name implies, the windows and doors are open, and you can get very high levels of ACH levels going on there, air changes per hour. It begins at 35 and goes on up. You have heating, ventilation, and cooling systems, and typically those ACH levels are between 4 and 6 air changes per hour. And as you move into more elite settings and elite situations, it goes into 12 or more air changes per hour. There's exhaust fans, and many of us who were around in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, we knew about bars and auto machine shops, things like that. People would smoke, etc. Many of those facilities used exhaust fans, and those exhaust fans were very effective. They would basically have air changes per hour at 60 or more. In other words, that air was changed every single minute. And that's why people were able to smoke and not basically be trapped inside of a cloud of smoke. Then there's other technology out there. There's a thing out there called ceiling level UV lights, sometimes called upper room UV lights, or germicidal control systems. And there is a long history there. It's well established. It's 80 plus years old, and they've been able to equate equivalent air changes per hour and come up with a number for these systems. In other words, you could either have a mechanical system providing 24 air changes per hour, or you could use these electronic based systems based on UV light, and they'll provide an effective air change per hour of 24 air changes per hour or more. Right now we have a new technology that surfaced because of LEDs that are now available, where we're able to control the frequency spectrum coming from these lights more effectively, is the best way to describe it. And they're called far UV 222 lights. Once again, these things have a long history that trace and connect back to the UV lights, but they're different because a narrow band of frequencies was found where there's no need to basically have it be at the ceiling level. An entire space can be illuminated with these lights, and they will basically provide germicidal protection, contagion mitigation, and they operate at 24 E changes per hour or more. And here's the interesting thing: because they're illuminating the entire space, there's no need for surface cleaning. The surfaces are constantly being disinfected. And then we have room sanitizers, and all kinds of different room sanitizers, and they're mixed in with ionization systems, etc. And those things are portable, and because they're portable, they really can't produce a lot of air changes per hour. They run between 1 and 2 air changes per hour for relatively small rooms. And there's a reason for that. They're portable, which means they need to be lightweight. So the motors inside of there are not very big, and they make a lot of noise. And when you put them on the high setting where you can actually get 1 or 2 air changes per hour, you probably can't use the room all that effectively. And the reality is, if you're going to deal with a classroom, for example, that's 30 feet by 30 feet by 10 feet, you're going to need 4 of these things in that classroom, and the noise is unbearable. So they're not engineered for that kind of scenario. They're engineered for a different kind of scenario, such as, a one-person office, a small office someplace, but they're really not set up for public settings. So what can you do in your home? There's home ventilation actions that you can take, and then there's costs associated with it, because people always tend to be cognizant of costs, and that kind of prevents them from doing things that they should be doing. Well, step A is, when guests arrive, you should take a look at your thermostat and turn on the fan when the guests arrive, and that'll circulate the air in your house, and it'll provide an air change level, whether it's 3, 5, 6 air changes per hour. It'll be changing that air in that house while the guests are there. When they leave, you turn it off. So what are the costs? It turns out that the home fan motors don't take a lot of power. The power and cost is associated with heating and cooling, not with the fan operations. And so what we're talking about is maybe 1 to 3 100-watt light bulbs while the fan is operating. So let's take a look at public buildings ventilations, actions, and costs. Right now, the guidance is that folks must turn on the ventilation system 1 hour before and leave that ventilation system running, and have it run 1 hour after the public leaves. So public arrives and leaves 1 hour before, 1 hour after. Most commercial facilities are not on-demand systems and the fans run all the time, so there's no cost impact. Now, an on-demand system is a system where it's off until a certain temperature threshold is reached and the heat turns on or the cooling turns on. And again, most commercial facilities are not these kinds of on-demand systems. The fans are always running. So there's no cost impact. But here's the reality. There are serious maintenance issues because these are big facilities and they're hard to keep track of and maintain, for lack of a better word. And that is why the ACH levels must be determined, and kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but they also must be posted and disclosed to the public, because the idea is we can't let the maintenance fall behind in these public facilities anymore. Now, there are facilities that use on-demand systems and there are some cost impacts. For example, clubhouses may fall into that category, lower-end public facilities, etc. They are negligible in terms of cost because the fans, again, take little power once compared to heating and cooling. It's like the home scenario. And those that are actually concerned about the costs of these systems, they have the opportunity to basically switch over and use UV or far UV 222 systems, which will run at about 10% the cost of mechanical motors when you turn on the fan in the HVAC system. So what are the commercial building challenges? It's more about proper maintenance and operation, because this is going to lead to an air change per hour of 0. For example, the system is off when it should be on, or an ACH level of 1. And this happens because vents are blocked. Someone may have closed dampers partially. Who knows who may have done that? Are timers working properly? Are sensors, fans, and dampers working properly? Do the vents, for example, have streamers so people can see the system is working? That's something that actually existed in the last century and it kind of went away. Now, periodic inspections with documented evidence showing certificates that are posted will ensure effective maintenance, but that's not happening yet. So what can we do in terms of operations? You turn on the HVAC fans 1 hour before people enter, and 1 hour after people leave, you turn it off. When you enter the facility, make sure the fans are turned on. If not, turn them on. Place a sign at each thermostat stating to turn on the fan and show how to turn on the fan. Many people may not know how to do that. And if the fans fail to operate or you are unable to see the thermostat display, report it immediately to whoever is responsible for that facility. And then set up training sessions to show people how to turn fans on and off, for example, in a clubhouse situation. So what can we do from a maintenance perspective? We should make sure that all of the HVAC fans work. Make sure the vents are not blocked or closed. Again, we can place streamers on the vents so people can see that they are actually working. We should replace the batteries in all the thermostats so that the displays are visible and people can see what they are doing. And then ensure that the filters are replaced every 3 months. So what else can we do? We can engage in disclosure to using anemometers where the airflow was measured from each vent and ACH levels were determined for each room. Moving forward, we can do some other things. We can gather data from the HVAC vendor to determine design ACH levels. We can disclose the ACH levels for each room via email and on the website. We can post room certificates showing the measured ACH levels, and we can update the certificate every 3 months to show that the system is being monitored and maintained effectively. Now, these are the tools that are used to measure the ACH levels in the room. Basically, you need a tape measure because you have to measure the size of the room, length, width, and height. Got to get that ceiling height. And there's a thing out there called an anemometer, which costs about $19. Anybody can go off and buy it. And you basically measure the airflow coming out of each vent. You add it all up, and you basically determine your total cubic feet per hour from all the vents divided by the cubic feet of that room, and voila, you have an ACH level for that room. Now I measured the ACH levels in my house, and what you see here are different rooms, the number of vents in each room, and the ACH level that was measured for each room. There's also an additional column over here called System On, and it says yes, no, or fail. Basically, it's an indication of how the system is being operated and what the maintenance level is. Because there's a yes in there, it basically means that I turn on those fans when guests arrive. And when the guests leave, I leave the fans on for about an hour, and then I turn it off. And I also know that the system is operating because I've taken a look at the vents, I maintain the system, make sure the filters are replaced, etc. Now, at one time, I was mismanaging this system, and I was actually closing off vents in the house between the upstairs and downstairs, depending on the seasons. And I was actually told by an old HVAC person that that was the wrong thing to do, that I should always have all of the vents open in the house all the time because the house was designed to have ventilation flow through all of the space. And once I close down those vents, I basically cause a lot of problems in terms of ventilation. And I also stress the system a little bit. This is just some more information on my house, and if you notice that there's some areas that have 0 air changes per hour. Now this happens to be a very open floor plan. So, the implication is that the foyer, number 10 over here, has 0 air changes per hour, but that space is actually shared with the living room and dining room, and there's just a massive amount of flow between all of these areas. And it's the same thing with the stairs and the hallways in this open floor plan house. Now obviously all of these values are approximate, and that's because it has to do with ceiling height measurements and ventilation size approximations. The house happens to have cathedral ceilings, so there's different angles, etc. And the HVAC design for the system is actually 4 air changes per hour. And the way one can determine the HVAC design is to basically go take a look at the model number of the HVAC system, and encoded in the model number is the size of the fan. And I was able to determine the size of that fan, I was able to determine the cubic feet of the house, and the design level was 4 air changes per hour. The actual measured value was 3.2 or 3.3 depending how you sum up all of these ACH levels. So what's the difference between the measured and the design reductions that we're seeing here? Well, there's a couple of things going on. One is that there's air resistance from the filter in the system, and there's also air resistance in the ducts. There's also another issue. You're actually able to control the fan speed in the heating unit. And for example, my fan speed was very low in heat mode when we first moved into the house. It's new construction. And as the years went by, I found myself needing to increase that fan speed because when the temperature would drop very low, the heater would actually go into an emergency mode condition because it was overheating, and it would shut down the heating mechanism. In order to deal with that, I increased the fan speed, and at some point I went to a fan speed where we are right now, and it's unclear when I turn on the fan, for example, whether it's using the maximum speed that's available in the system or whether it's using the speed associated with the heater. Now air conditioning tends to have a maximum fan speed. Again, it's unclear what the fan is really doing, which speed it's picking up. I suspect, however, that the fan is probably running at full speed and that these reductions are a result of, again, the filter and the ducts in the system. So how was this done? Again, I bought an anemometer, $19, went to one of the stores, bought 2 broomstick handles, and bought a selfie stick to hold the anemometer. And the selfie stick and the broomsticks were used to basically get those cathedral ceiling vents. And initially I just had a piece of paper where I'd write things down on a piece of paper. I eventually graduated to a spreadsheet. I eventually wrote a program, and there's actually another program that I wrote, and it turns out that writing down these numbers, even though you'd think it's simple, it gets kind of confusing. There's a lot of things that you're writing down, and this is actually a 3rd generation tool, for lack of a better word, to capture all these numbers. Again, it's not hard to do, But, as you think about it, there's a lot of rooms, there's vents, there's all of this methodical stuff you have to do. And then you say, well, did I really measure this length here properly? Did I get that vent size properly? Did I miss something here, etc.? So there's a program that is basically used to capture this stuff right now. And it's integrated with something larger that we'll be talking about later. Oh, I guess we're going to be talking about it right now. There's a clean air buildings database that I established. This is the link to it, and basically there's several hundred buildings in there, thousands of rooms, tens of thousands of rooms, and basically data from all over the place. The Philadelphia school system decided to post site survey data from 234 schools that they have, and I captured that data and added an additional column to identify the air changes per hour. What they did is they hired 5 contractors, and they measured all of the rooms, and they measured the ventilation rates coming from all of the vents, but for example they didn't provide the height of all of the rooms, so I needed to make assumptions about the height, and they didn't add that extra column to figure out what the air changes per hour were. Isn't that interesting? Now the Philadelphia restaurant program, that came from the health department rather than the school district. You'd think that they'd be talking to each other. No, not really. Now they again created a program where people would go off and determine their air changes per hour, and they would essentially self-certify themselves. And that information was posted out on the internet, just like the Philadelphia School District. And there's other schools, and there's restaurants, and there's airports, and there's airplanes, all inside of this Clean Air Buildings database. So you can search it to see if there's a facility there that you're interested in visiting, what it might be. And you can also add to this database if you actually happen to have data. And there's actually instructions on how you can possibly make some estimates on what the air changes per hour might be within a facility. For example, you go to a restaurant, you take a look, you see what's going on, and there's some instructions to try to get a feel for what might be going on in terms of air changes per hour. This is a suggested short-term action plan for any facility out there. The reality is many facilities are very large, and there are many components that make up those facilities, and things just tend to break. For example, fans do not operate. So basically you need to go through and fix any broken fans. Fix areas that have 0 ventilation readings. Open any closed dampers and vents because of previous complaints of hot or cold air. Adjust or change vent types so that there are no complaints, but keep the vents open. Now going beyond the normal maintenance of a ventilation system, we can post signs to turn on the fans and provide simple instructions. Post certificates at each thermostat with a date showing that the maintenance date and the average ACH level. And we can place streamers in all events so people can see that the ventilation system is running. And then we do this until the COVID-19 disaster is over, and sadly that's probably going to be in about 10 years. So the HVAC inspection certificate might look something like this. You identify the zone, who's the HVAC vendor, when did they come, when did they change the filter, what kind of filter did they put in, a MERV 13, whatever. What is the fan mode, and is it operational, is the thing working? What about all the vents, are they all working? Is the thermostat display visible? Do you have to replace the batteries? Are the timers working and set? Does the thermostat have instructions that people can easily access and read? Does the staff turn on the fans when they enter the building, for example? And then get the design data for the facility. Get the fan cubic feet per minute so people can actually figure out what the design level is for the building, and then get the measured level for what is actually happening in the building to see if there's a discrepancy, to see if there's other systemic problems. Going a step further, each room can have a certificate posted with some key elements, like the room name, square feet, cubic feet, CFM, ACH level. And once again, are the vents unblocked, the dampers open, timers working, who inspected it, the date, and maybe some comments. The same thing can happen for the entire building as a whole. Basically, you could post it in the lobby, building name and address, square feet, cubic feet, total CFM in that building, the minimum, maximum, and average ACH levels in the building. Again, who's the inspection authority? Could be self, no big deal. And then the date, and then some comments. This is a suggested long-term action plan that can be applied to any facility. Consider adding ceiling-level upper room UVC lights. It's proven technology with massive science and engineering going back to 1937. It's used in commercial and industrial settings and public buildings like hospitals, elite schools, elite restaurants, elite condominiums. This will add an additional 24 EACH or equivalent air changes per hour to the rooms where it's applied. Consider adding FAR UV 222 lights from Columbia University, and this is relatively new based on LED technology. However, the science and engineering is based on ceiling level UVC lights, so again, it's rock solid. This will add an additional 24 EACH to all other rooms, and because it shines all the way down to the surface, this will eliminate surface cleaning. So these are the references to the ceiling level upper room UVC and FAR UV 222 lights. There's actually a great series of presentations that were provided in 2020, and it was held by the National Academies of Sciences. And for those of you that are not aware, the National Academy of Sciences is a private nonprofit society of distinguished scholars established by an act of Congress signed by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, and the NAS is charged with providing independent, objective advice to the nation on the matters related to science and technology. So this is what they've been doing since 1863. So here go some examples of ceiling level UVC lights. On the left hand side we see basically a shelter kind of situation. Upper right hand corner happens to be a school, and lower right hand corner, that is an airport. It kind of looks like LAX, but it may not be LAX, not sure where that is. This is an example of the FAR UV 222 lights being used. Again, if these things are used, surface cleaning is not required anymore because it goes all the way down to the surface. Upper left hand corner, it's some kind of bar restaurant. Upper right hand corner looks like an airport. It sort of looks like LaGuardia, but it may not be. Maybe someplace in the Middle East. I don't really know. We have a train kind of situation down at the bottom. Once again, not sure where it is. Could be someplace in the Pacific Rim, maybe Australia, Japan, who knows. But these are different applications of FAR UV 222 systems. And this is kind of a really neat picture that identifies how these things work. There's some numbers identified here for folks that are doing analysis, but the image is very clear. The ceiling level UVC lights is basically the picture on the left hand side, and because air is constantly moving, there's convection in the air where cold air is dropping, hot air is rising. Things tend to go up to that upper level ceiling level, and when the contagions go up there, they basically get deactivated, destroyed for lack of a better word, by the UV lights up there. On the right hand side, what you have is that unique frequency that was picked called FAR UV 222 lights that doesn't impact us at all. It doesn't penetrate the water barrier of our eyes. It doesn't penetrate the dead skin layers that we have on our bodies, but it does penetrate and deal with viruses and contagions, and it deactivates them. So this is, again, a way to visualize how these things work. And there are numbers. All of this stuff has been reduced to numbers to figure out what the effectiveness is. So I want to have some closing comments here. In the last century, our parents and grandparents had to deal with tuberculosis and other deadly infections. Vaccines did a great deal to eliminate those contagions, but they would not have worked without the introduction of forced air HVAC systems and ceiling level UV systems. It was a very interesting time. You know, airplanes were coming into their own. People were trying to understand what it meant to have a life support system on an airplane. You go above 10,000 feet, you start to freeze to death, you run out of oxygen. You know, all of this stuff was coming together, and the HVAC systems were key. The forced air heating and cooling systems, and also the UV systems were key to dealing with all of this stuff. Now, unlike in the last century, no new technology is needed. We just need to use what our parents and grandparents developed. And there always will be unvaccinated people. That's reality, okay? And the system solution must use vaccines and ventilation. And the analysis clearly shows why. Large numbers of people will continue to get sick and die, and the research clearly shows that. You know, I hesitated to put this table in this presentation because, you know, it's very serious over here. These kinds of numbers, this kind of analysis is typically associated with big science and big engineering and people who are frankly used to dealing with these kinds of massive problems. And what you see over here is the air change's impact on lives saved. And this analysis was done in 2020, and it shows the impact of each mitigation subsystem on lives saved. Now, what are the mitigation subsystems? Well, one subsystem is vaccination. Another subsystem is forced air HVAC systems. A third subsystem is the use of UV in facilities. So let's take a look at the bottom row here in yellow. If we had no vaccines, we had no treatments available, we were looking at 11 million people passing away in the United States. At the time, the death rate was identified as 3.5%. Now, if we had basically introduced the vaccine very early on, if we had it available instantly, we would have some number of people naturally immune, some number of people would get the vaccine, and some number of people would have effectiveness levels associated with that vaccine. And those numbers would range between 2 and 5 million people. Those are enormous numbers, okay? Now, let's take a look what would have happened if we had proper ventilation systems like we had in the last century. I'm going to say that because that's reality. With the energy crisis, all of our ventilation systems changed. They were drastically reduced. And we also threw away all of our UV stuff. The only place you're going to find the UV stuff is in heavy industrial and heavy commercial settings and hospital settings. It's no longer out there in the space, in normal use. Well, had we had those systems out there, for example, let's go down to that bottom row again. Without the vaccine, if we had those systems in place, we would have been looking at 800,000 people passing away. You know what that means? That means we would not have had a pandemic, or an epidemic, at least in the United States. It could have potentially prevented the epidemic from surfacing in the United States. That's how big this is. That's what this analysis is showing. Now, whether this analysis is valid is a different issue. Okay, woulda, shoulda, coulda. You know, we didn't have it, so here we sit. Now, with the vaccines, what's going on with the vaccines? Okay, some people are not being vaccinated because they can't, because of health reasons. Some people don't have access to the vaccines. Nothing you can do about it. They don't have access to the vaccines because of cost reasons. They don't have access to the vaccines because they're just not permitted to get the vaccine yet. They're in a certain age group. So what's going on if we introduce these kinds of things with our ventilation systems? Had we started in 2020 doing this stuff, and oh, by the way, this information was disclosed, the numbers we would have been looking at are on the right-hand side. You know, we would have been looking at 300,000 and 141,000 people passing away. Again, as time moved on, more people were passing away, and it would have taken time to upgrade the infrastructure. So obviously we would have never reached those numbers. However, if the infrastructure already was in place, what we had before the energy crisis with the vaccines, that's what we potentially could have been looking at. This chart is a big deal. And again, it's not for the faint of heart. And this is what's called big science and big engineering. So continuing with closing comments, you know, it's going to take years for the building codes to change to include contagion mitigation and, you know, what they're going to do about it. It's going to happen, however, because there's going to be no choice. So what can we do? As responsible managers of our children's future, we could stop using the phrase increased ventilation. That has no meaning. It's like saying, my car goes fast. Well, does it go from 0 to 60 in 4 seconds? Or does it go from 0 to 60 in 12 or 15 seconds? What is it? We must talk in terms of ventilation performance levels using the decades-old ACH levels. My building has an average 5 ACH. My building has an average 10 ACH. My room over here has an average 12 ACH. And we must post those ACH levels throughout our buildings. Now, we're not here to determine the future minimum ACH levels that will become part of the future building certificates of occupancy. Again, it's going to happen because there's no choice. We are here to measure and document the building ventilation levels and post the resulting ACH performance levels throughout the building. Now, this is all very interesting. How did I fall down this path? Basically, this approach of building assessment and disclosure was inspired by a faculty meeting at Drexel University where I disclosed my research. And I had already started to think about this, and it turns out that multiple people chimed in, and they also had similar ideas and similar conclusions, including a facility manager, and it happens to be the school facility that had the contagion outbreak, the COVID-19 outbreak in that second grade class where the 8 students were infected, and someone went and closed the dampers in that room. So facility types, again, there's elite facilities, there's the medium facilities, and the low-end facilities. And the bottom line is, where do you want to live and work, and where do you want your children and grandchildren to live and work? So how can we possibly proceed at a grassroots level? It turns out that I've been requested to prepare a number of white papers to basically submit to different organizations to get this kind of activity going. And that paper has been converted to a generic ventilation performance disclosure request form. What you can do is you can download that disclosure form. It is actually posted on the link over here having to do with the clean air buildings area. It's the info sheet basically area, and there will be PDF and .doc links over there. And you can print off 1 to 5 pages of that paper and drop them off at clubhouses, in your work setting, in your school setting, perhaps where your children or grandchildren are going to school, houses of worship, restaurants, bars, store customer service desks, etc. The point is, this can be a grassroots kind of level, and there's a document there to help you with that kind of grassroots disclosure level. These are some key references. These are the CDC air changes per hour guidelines references. That's where the 12 air changes per hour for airborne contagion room is identified, and there is a whole raft of ACH levels identified there, and there's also a document talking about various aspects of this situation. These are references to the Philadelphia restaurant program. I hope these links stay up there for a very long period of time, because they basically tell you how to figure out the ACH level in all of your rooms. They have online videos. They're on YouTube. Click on those videos as soon as you can. Take a look at what they did to basically get that restaurant program up and running. Anybody can do this. It doesn't require massive skills. These are references to the school case history. Again, it's very important because it identified, some big issues that allowed us to put a stake in the ground in terms of, what is the minimum ACH level at which people get infected. These are references to building codes and standards. Basically, the building codes and standards are connecting to private organizations. You have to pay to get those things, which is problematic. And all they've done is they basically reduced it to comfort levels, and the challenge has been to constantly reduce costs. Right now we have a big issue having to do with sustainability. So folks in the sustainability community are basically in that same vein where they're trying to reduce the ventilation rates to reduce energy costs. So anyway, these are references to building codes and standards. They're going to have to change moving forward. This is the link to the Philadelphia School Site Survey. There's a spreadsheet on Google Docs there. I think it's like 237 tabs. Each tab is a school. Each row is basically a room. I have actually, downloaded that spreadsheet and I performed analysis, and it's on my links. You can find my analysis that I performed using this source data. And then a lot of people talk about, well, what does this mean in terms of like the flu season cost, and is this going to be like the flu? It's not going to be like the flu, unfortunately. There will be more people dying from this than the flu for a long time. But the flu season itself is a problem, along with other airborne contagions during different seasons. Some folks have done all kinds of different analysis. This is just one set of references identifying what the costs are and lost productivity. Again, it's obvious what's really going on. We have to deal with the air quality in our buildings, just like we deal with the water quality in our buildings, just like we deal with the power, electricity challenges in our buildings so people don't get electrocuted, the sewage systems, etc. And here's the reality. These buildings are closed systems. If you walk into that building and you're in there with people, it is quite possible that if the ventilation system is not running, eventually you will start to run out of oxygen, and eventually you will start to get CO2 poisoning. And that's actually how they're designing and maintaining the systems today. These are links and contact information. The research I'm maintaining online. There's a book that I released having to do with the first year of the research. It's about 700 pages. There's a lot of stuff in there. And there's an equivalent amount of research that will be coming out in a future book on these web pages. So this is the big picture. This is an effort to enable a grassroots movement to get buildings to disclose their ventilation rates as air changes per hour for each room and the whole building as a whole, everywhere. I want to thank you for attending and listening. I hope you have a better understanding of ventilation going forward. Please keep in mind that when it comes up in conversation, try to inform people what ventilation really means. It has to do with the air changes per hour inside of a facility, how well our facilities are maintained, if the system is on or off when we are in a public room setting, disclosure because we've taken ventilation systems for granted, and then this whole issue of trust but verify. But the reality is, in the systems world, we never trust anyone. We structure systems to protect people from themselves, and as part of that structure, we always verify everything, period. And consider the grassroots movement approach, because quite frankly, this is where we are at this point in time.